Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Law of Attraction Life Coaching Podcast. I'm Laura, and if you don't know me already, I am a life coach, a lecturer, and I'm currently writing a book about how you can protect your mental health, and I'm also writing another book on my technique to get myself out of depression and anxiety into where I am now. And I'm hoping that in quarantine I'm going to have the discipline to finish these for you, because I keep talking about them and I haven't finished them yet. So I look forward to sharing that with you once I'm finished. Now, today I wanted to talk to you about domestic violence, actually, and I think it's something that has become almost quite a massive problem because people are in quarantine. And if you are in a situation where you have a partner that you live with who is violent, it's very difficult in quarantine, because a lot of the coping strategies that you may have had, like leaving, going to stay over a friend's house, or being able to get out of the house for kind of exercise or a walk or to go shopping, you haven't got those coping strategies anymore. And I think that actually quarantine and this process can actually be quite a positive opportunity for all people, to take a very in-depth look at their lives and actually how they're living those lives and whether or not that is what they wanted for their life. Now, domestic violence is a really complex issue because it's not just one person, it's two people and often children involved as well. And so what it leads to is lots and lots of people being damaged by improper coping strategies and improper ways of dealing with our own stress and anxiety and upset. And I think that it's quite an interesting point is that people say, we hurt the ones that we love, we hurt those that we're closest to. And that's true in effect. Domestic violence, most people who are violent in the home, they're violent in the home because they feel safe enough to be violent. They feel secure in that situation, that their bad behaviour isn't going to be stopped in some way, shape or form, because the person that they're being violent towards is accepting of it. Now that sounds quite victim blaming, but in the complex situation of domestic violence, there are members that are complicit in the action, and there are members who are deliberate in the action. And I think that something that's quite difficult, and speaking from experience with domestic violence, is that it's a very slow, it's a process of boiling a toad. If you've heard of that phrase, how do you boil a toad? Well, you slowly, and you put the toad in a pot of water and you slowly turn up the temperature degree by degree until before the toad knows it's boiling. And that's a little bit like a process of domestic violence. Domestic violence isn't something that suddenly one minute you're going from happy couple that are loved and enjoying everything and everything's great, to going to severe violence. It doesn't tend to happen like that. What tends to happen is a slow process of bad behaviour creeping in. And something that's really important is to have a level of self-awareness of yourself and have that self-reflectivity to actually look at whether or not your behaviour is abusive. And also, if you're somebody who believes that they may be being abused, you have to have an awareness and an ability to track what's going on, to actually ensure that you can quantify what is happening to you, instead of it being a process where you're being slowly boiled. And this is a difficult process because life is complex and people slip into habits and patterns quickly. We often kind of take a slow slide down the descent as opposed to kind of down to the bottom of it. And most people, if they fell that quickly into the abyss of domestic violence, they'd notice it very quickly. If your partner's gone from being very loving and kind to the next minute punching you in the face, you can recognise that. But actually what domestic violence tends to be is a slow descent into it, where it starts off with verbal abuse, with emotional manipulation, and then slowly moving into violence of some form. Now, violence doesn't always have to take the place of physical violence. You know, violence comes in many different ways. Emotional abuse is a form of violence, I would say, and for a lot of people, the emotional abuse can actually be more damaging than physical violence. You know, bruises and cuts heal if you are being perpetually abused emotionally and psychologically on a daily basis. That can take its toll on a person. And what happens is that the abuser tends to defile the victim's emotions, sense of self, ability of understanding of what's going on in life. They gaslight them. Gaslighting is a process of basically making the other person believe that what they're saying is not true. So, you know, if the victim says, you know, last week you did this to the abuser, and the abuser would turn around and say, I didn't do that, what are you on about, you're mad. And this causes the victim to doubt their own sanity. It causes the victim to doubt that they have a grip on reality, which is terrifying. I've had this done to me. I have been gaslit in the past, and it's a very terrifying feeling to doubt your own, you know, your own sense of self and grip of reality. You know, when you've got somebody who's perpetually telling you that what you're saying is incorrect and that you are perceiving things wrong, it does allow doubt to creep in. You know, and that doubt is very, very detrimental, because what the doubt does is it stops the victim from trusting their own perception of what is happening. And when the victim stops trusting the perception of what is happening, they're less likely to seek help. Now, the problem with domestic violence is the silence, okay? And in the silence is where the abuse can happen. Now, I think it's so important for us all to be brave and to talk about it. You know, I don't like talking about this, to be honest, but I think that we all have to be brave, because if I'm brave and I talk about it, then hopefully you guys will be brave and talk about it. And we have to create a sense of an environment where it's okay to talk about these things, that the shame doesn't lie with the victim. And more often than not, the shame does lie with the victim, because the abusers have to be in a certain mental state, normally of kind of an egocentric perception of themselves, and they've also gaslit themselves when they gaslit you. And so even for them, they kind of a lot of times question whether or not they've even done the things that they think that you think they've done, that they have actually done. You know, and if you've got somebody who's violent in alcohol or in rage or in red mist, you know, your person, your partner, their conscious self isn't actually there. You know, same through drugs or whatever. You know, their normal level of consciousness is actually there in that moment, and so they aren't really functioning within themselves to be able to carry that memory with them in such a way as what it would be as if they'd had a conversation with you in the morning that was normal. You know, they're acting from a place of trauma, and when they're acting from a place of trauma, what that causes is an issue with their memory, and then they gaslight you, which causes yet more issues with the memory, and then it opens up this space where actually nobody has full recollection of what has happened. You know, the victim's going through post-traumatic stress disorder from the things that have happened. The brain tends to shut down and tries to block out traumatic memories. You know, we see within sort of huge levels of trauma, people actually losing their memories, and this is a protective stance of your psychology, a protective stance of your brain, because it just doesn't want to hold on to that level of trauma, and so what it does is it blocks it out. And we see, you know, children and adults with huge levels of trauma that they compartmentalize. The brain splits, and they store memories compartmentalized into other parts of their brains, in effect, that are not accessible by their normal state. And so this can lead into huge problems, because the silence is created in these situations because people are fearful to speak up. They're fearful that what they're saying might not be fully true, that they don't really know what truly happened, that they're worried that they're losing their grip on reality, and maybe they're mad and maybe they will become sectioned. They're worried about what they will look like. People don't want to be victims of these things. You know, it's embarrassing to say that the person that you chose and the person that you were in love with has actually become your abuser. That's embarrassing for a victim, and as much as it shouldn't be embarrassing, it is, because it's humiliating. You know, it feels humiliating for the victim because it erodes your judgment. It erodes your judgment and your sense of self and your understanding of your part in the world, you know. And when you've chosen somebody, especially if you've married this person, you know, you've married somebody that you have professed to be such a good person, such a wonderful person, that out of all the other people on this planet, you've married them, and then this person has become your abuser. That's a really tough pill to swallow, but you know, it's really important. It's so important that we break the silence, because it's within the silence that domestic violence is allowed to continue, because people don't know about it. And when people aren't called out for their own shit, they don't need to change. You know, there is no change that needs to happen. You know, I had a childhood of keeping secrets, and it was in those secrets that all of the pain and all the suffering was allowed to continue. And it was only until, you know, when I was 15 and I broke the silence, was that then things managed to mend. Then things managed to begin to you know, it was shit to begin with. It was a lot worse. You know, when you break the silence, I mean, that's not good. That's a painful situation to go through, but it is the opportunity for the beginning of healing. And so you must have the courage to speak your truth and to say what you think is happening and to say how you feel. Because within that courage allows you the opportunity to get help and to get support from friends, from, you know, domestic violence, charities, from the police, from whomever you feel the need to get help from. And, you know, I think for a lot of people who are dealing with a partner who is violent or who is going through stuff, you can't help them. And I think that's a really tough thing to go through. I think that they must recognise that they have a problem and that they need to go out and seek help. You doing things, you know, seeking advice from charities, you know, you can help yourself, but you can't change them, and you can't change the way that they deal with things or the perspectives or create new coping strategies for them. You can sure as hell say to that person, this is what, you know, what you're doing isn't right, and I deserve better and I'm not accepting of it. And I would say, personally, from going through it, that staying with that person throughout that healing journey isn't actually helpful for either of you. I mean, there may be cases to stay with them, but I would have said a level of separation for you two whilst both of you healed was really important. Because when you stay with your partner, and I'm not saying that when you separate, that's it, you get divorced and it's the end of the relationship. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm suggesting is that you get some space between the two of you, because something has intrinsically gone massively wrong when people become violent and abusive towards their spouses. And what it shrieks of is unhealed trauma, psychological problems, psychological issues, and ineffective coping strategies to deal with immeasurable emotions and stress. So the person that tends to react in a violent or abusive situation is going through a lot themselves. And if you are there being that person's support for the thing that they are doing wrong to you, when are you going to heal? You can't, because you're having to be the support for that person. Now, what I think is really important is that both parties separate. They come over here and this person does their healing and coping strategies with a professional, and this person does their coping strategies and healing with their professional, and they have some joint counselling as well together to allow to mediate between the problems that have brought them there and to heal. Now, if you've been through domestic violence and your partner has been violent towards you, some people can't forgive that. But if you recognise that most of the time when this person is being violent and aggressive towards you is because they're hurt themselves and that they're dealing with something themselves, it's easiest to forgive. But that is a very tough, higher level thought process to be able to get to, because you have to extradite yourself from the situation and look at what they're going through. And if you're in pain and suffering, you can't extradite yourself from the situation because you're smack bang right in the middle of it. You know, you can't see anything but the storm because you're in the eye of it. Whereas actually, if you can come out of it, you can see that there's, you know, the storm will end. This too shall pass. But you know, domestic violence is a really tough thing to go through, and both parties need to heal. You know, whether you are the victim or the demonstrator of violence and abuse, both parties are damaged, both parties need to heal. Both parties need very severe levels of counselling and psychotherapy to ensure that they can get through what they've gone through. You know, and both people need to learn to deal with the fallout of what is like a nuclear blast in a home, and to go to that, you know, adults have a sense of self and an understanding of their own esteem and worth and coping strategies, and they have this very steady foundation to stand on to deal with these things. If there are children in your home that are experiencing domestic violence and seeing this abuse going on a daily basis, you as a parent have a responsibility to take your children out of that situation and protect them. And as hard and as difficult as that is, the children don't have a firm foundation to be able to understand what is happening. And so they end up getting complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I created a podcast on this a few weeks ago. And if you want to go back and watch that, I'll try and link it somewhere up here. But the complex post-traumatic stress disorder causes huge amounts of trouble and stress for that child to continue for the rest of their life. You, as a parent, are doing the massive injustice by keeping your children in domestic violence situations. I say that earnestly and as kindly as I possibly can. By keeping your children in a domestic violence situation, you are damaging them for life. And I don't say that lightly. You are damaging them for life. You change the way that their brain becomes constructed. You will cause them lifelong problems with anxiety, depression, health problems, you know, psychological issues, and that is not what parents are supposed to do. Now, parents are supposed to protect their children, and the difficulty is often that in domestic violence situations, the children stand up to protect their parents because they don't know what to do. They haven't got this steady foundation to stand on, and so the children take roles to protect parents, to look after parents. You know, if you've got a parent who has got an alcohol or a drug abuse problem and they're abusive in that time, the children cleave to their parents because their parents are their world. And you as an adult have a responsibility to look after those kids. And if you think that in the time and the situation that you're in, that actually those children are being damaged, then probably separation from them is better than keeping them in a violent home. You know, and that's hard, and I know that's hard, and as a parent, I'm not a parent, and I know that's people, you know, that can be easy to throw out when they're not your children, but your job for your children is to protect them regardless of anything, you know. And I would, as a parent, if I had that going on, I would much rather my children go and stay with their grandparent or my friend, or, you know, a cousin or an uncle or an aunt or somebody whom I trusted, so they were safe and in a situation where they were having a happy little holiday, than being in a violent situation with a mum and a dad who were, you know, dealing with terrifying and horrendous situations that children can't fully process and that will damage children for life. So you know, and children, they don't have to be party to everything. You know, make it something fun. Make it that they're going on a nice little holiday. Make it that they're going to stay with Aunt Joni or Aunt Sally, or, you know, Uncle Jacob or your grandma for a few weeks, whilst mum and dad paint the house or something. Make it something fun so the kids aren't privy to all of this. They've seen too much as it is. Now, if you're suffering with domestic violence at the moment in quarantine, it's incredibly difficult for you because you are trapped in your home with your abuser, which is a terrifying process, you know, and people are losing their lives, you know. There are horrendous statistics for domestic violence. you know, how many people die a week that are involved in domestic violence, how many children are being abused in their own homes. You know, domestic violence hurts everybody that is involved. Everybody, even the one who's perpetuating it. And the most important thing is to put an end to it. It's the most important thing. And so you need to have the strength and the confidence to break that silence and go and ask for help. And you know, there are domestic violence charities out there that you can go and speak to. You can contact the police. You know, if it's an emergency situation and you are being abused in that moment and you are frightened, then call the police. That is the right thing to do. And people are fearful of doing that because they're worried about the stigma of you know, turning their partner in, but they're also worried about what the fallout of that is going to be. Now, if you're in a home with somebody who's abusive, you call the police on them. It's only, as a victim, you feel it's only going to be worse the next time. And so you need to come up with a plan that removes you from the situation, and you need to find that braveness to actually do that and execute that. You know, and I think I saw something the other day where somebody said, you know, if you need me to call the police, I will do that for you. Or no, it said, if you witness domestic violence or you think domestic violence is happening, make sure you call the police. And I was kind of like, oof, you know, as a third party, getting involved in calling the police, that might actually be the worst thing that you can do. Because if you are in a domestic violence situation and the police are called and they turn up at the house and your partner thinks that it's you that have called them, that can begin an even higher level of abuse and violence happening in the home. And the victim didn't call them, another party did. And the police won't say who or what. They'll say, you know, we've been called to a disturbance at this residence. And they won't say who's called or a neighbour or whatever. And so it leaves that doubt to open up between the perpetrator and the victim, and that can actually cause a lot more trouble. And so I would say that if you believe that you are the neighbour of somebody who is suffering domestic violence, as somebody who's been through this, I wouldn't say to call the police, and that's probably quite controversial. If you think that somebody's going to be, you know, if you think something's really dangerous is happening, then yes, call the police. But if you're hearing shouting and noise and stuff and you call the police, then I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best route to take. I think that if I was party to that and there was a disturbance going on next door, I would probably go and ask if that person was all right, and I would try and speak to the person and find out what was going on, and I would instinctively speak to the woman first. And unfortunately there is a gender bias, that we believe that domestic violence only happens to women, and it doesn't. Domestic violence happens to men, women, to children, to, you know, between partners who are heterosexual, homosexual, across the board. It doesn't matter. Domestic violence happens to everybody. And, you know, if you are a man who is suffering from domestic violence, it can be harder for you to speak up because of that, you know, predetermined idea that it's the woman who's being abused. But it is in the silence that this problem can continue, and we must all start talking about it. If you're a third party and you think something's going on next door, break that silence. Go and knock on that door and ask if people are all right. You know, and ask to speak to everybody in that home. I want to speak to everybody. I want to speak. You know, dealing with terrifying and horrendous situations that children can't fully process and that will damage children for life. So, you know, and children, they don't have to be party to everything. You know, make it something fun. Make it that they're going on a nice little holiday. Make it that they're going to stay with Aunt Joni or Aunt Sally, or, you know, Uncle Jacob or your grandma for a few weeks, whilst Mum and Dad paint the house or something. Make it something fun so the kids aren't privy to all of this. They've seen too much as it is. Now, if you're suffering with domestic violence at the moment in quarantine, it's incredibly difficult for you because you are trapped in your home with your abuser, which is a terrifying process. You know, and people are losing their lives. You know, there are horrendous statistics for domestic violence. You know, how many people die a week that are involved in domestic violence, how many children are being abused in their own homes. You know, domestic violence hurts everybody that is involved. Everybody, even the one who's perpetuating it. And the most important thing is to put an end to it. It's the most important thing. And so you need to have the strength and the confidence to break that silence and go and ask for help. And you know, there are domestic violence charities out there that you can go and speak to. You can contact the police. You know, if it's an emergency situation and you are being abused in that moment and you are frightened, then call the police. That is the right thing to do. And people are fearful of doing that because they're worried about the stigma of you know, turning their partner in, but they're also worried about what the fallout of that is going to be. Now, if you're in a home with somebody who's abusive, you call the police on them. It's only, as a victim, you feel it's only going to be worse the next time. And so you need to come up with a plan that removes you from the situation, and you need to find that braveness to actually do that and execute that. You know, and I think I saw something the other day where somebody said, you know, if you need me to call the police, I will do that for you. Or no, it said, if you witness domestic violence or you think domestic violence is happening, make sure you call the police. And I was kind of like, oof, you know, as a third party, getting involved in calling the police, that might actually be the worst thing that you can do. Because if you are in a domestic violence situation and the police are called and they turn up at the house and your partner thinks that it's you that have called them, that can begin an even higher level of abuse and violence happening in the home. And the victim didn't call them, another party did. And the police won't say who or what. They'll say, you know, we've been called to a disturbance at this residence. And they won't say who's called or a neighbour or whatever. And so it leaves that doubt to open up between the perpetrator and the victim, and that can actually cause a lot more trouble. And so I would say that if you believe that you are the neighbour of somebody who is suffering domestic violence, as somebody who's been through this, I wouldn't say to call the police, and that's probably quite controversial. If you think that somebody's going to be, you know, if you think something's really dangerous is happening, then yes, call the police. But if you're hearing shouting and noise and stuff and you call the police, then I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best route to take. I think that if I was party to that and there was a disturbance going on next door, I would probably go and ask if that person was all right, and I would try and speak to the person and find out what was going on, and I would instinctively speak to the woman first. And unfortunately there is a gender bias, that we believe that domestic violence only happens to women, and it doesn't. Domestic violence happens to men, women, to children, to, you know, between partners who are heterosexual, homosexual, across the board. It doesn't matter. Domestic violence happens to everybody. And, you know, if you are a man who is suffering from a domestic violence, it can be harder for you to speak up because of that, you know, predetermined idea that it's the woman who's being abused. But it is in the silence that this problem can continue, and we must all start talking about it. If you're a third party and you think something's going on next door, break that silence. Go and knock on that door and ask if people are all right. You know, and I think I'd rather be a nosy neighbour than somebody who's living next to somebody who's been killed whilst I was listening. And that's the tough reality of it. You know, people die every day from domestic violence. You know, violence is happening on a daily basis, and no doubt during quarantine that's something that has actually gotten worse. And so it's really important that you create exit strategies for yourself. You know, and an exit strategy is looking at how you can get yourself out of that home, you know, and seek help. And if you speak to domestic violence charities, they can help you with this. But obviously you need somewhere to go, somewhere to get out, and somewhere to, you know, some way to call for help. You know, and police are very helpful in domestic violence situations, as well as domestic violence charities. And unfortunately, once the victim leaves, actually the risk of violence and the risk of them being killed gets worse, and more people are killed after they've left the situation in that first month, you know, after they've left the situation, and actually when they're living in it. And that's the bigger fear, is that often people who are violent towards their partner say, if you ever leave me, I will kill you. And unfortunately a lot of those people are telling the truth when they say that. but you can't heal in a domestic violence situation. It will not get better. It will not change. It won't suddenly remedy overnight because you stayed with your partner. The only way to remedy is removing yourself from the situation and seeking help. And you need to seek help as a victim. The perpetrator needs to seek help. And if they're not willing to do that, then they're not willing to remedy the situation. If they believe that they are perfect and that they haven't done anything wrong and that there is no problem, then there is no solution. There's no solution to them fixing the situation. They are not going to, you know, make this better or remedy the situation at all. And so it's hopeless, and you staying in the home is doing nothing but damaging you and damaging your children if you have any. And so it's really important that you have that courage to leave the situation, because it isn't going to get better. You know, and the only way that it will get better is by something drastic happening, and that drastic happening tends to be you having the courage to create an exit strategy and getting out of the situation and taking your children with you and going through a process of divorce or separation and a process of counselling, therapy and healing for you, the perpetrator and the children, to ensure that everybody is healed from this terrible, terrible situation. You know, and there are opportunities to get healing and to have good relationships after it, but staying in the situation isn't the answer to it. It never will be. Nothing good can come from staying in the situation, because if you stay, you also validate the behaviour that the perpetrator is behaving, how they're behaving. You're saying that what you're doing is okay and that I'm going to stick around. You know, and if they're violent or they're abusive or they're emotionally abusive towards you, they're vindictive, whatever, you're saying to them, it's okay, I'm going to stay. No matter what you do to me, I love you and I'm going to stay. And you're creating a rod for your own back as much as you are being complicit in continuing the problem with the person that you are living with your partner, whomever is abusive. So it's a tough topic. I find these tough topics very stressful actually to talk about sometimes on podcasts, but I think that it is really important. I feel like they're not particularly fun podcasts to watch. I feel a little bit like most of you have probably turned off by now. But I think it's really important that we talk about this stuff, and I think that as difficult and as horrible it is to have these conversations that are really tough conversations, you know, I think the more that we are all honest and the more that we talk about these things, especially people who have been victims of this stuff, the more that we talk and create it to be okay to talk about this stuff is, as I said, it breaks the silence where it allows these things to continue and this stuff to happen. So to end on a little happy note, this is Little Face. Little Face, come and say hello to everyone. This is Little Face. She's just joined us halfway through. She says, hello everyone. Sorry guys, Little Face had to run away. So I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's been a bit of a tough topic, but it is an important one to talk about, as I said before. I hope you guys are having a great quarantine and that you're looking after yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you all soon, okay? Take care of yourselves. Bye.